My brother destroyed me out of academic envy, and my parents abandoned me for 7 years, now that he's dead and confessed everything in his diary. They come back begging for forgiveness, but I had the police remove them from my house. I'm 26 years old. I work in real estate, and honestly, I make more money than I ever thought I'd have. But there's a story I need to tell because it literally consumes me inside, and I don't know if I'm being a horrible son or if I'm finally doing the right thing. Like 3 weeks ago, my parents showed up at my door after 7 years of not talking to me. And when I say 7 years, I mean I haven't received a single text message, not a call on my birthday, nothing, zero contact. And now suddenly, they want us to act like we're a normal family. But I have to go back pretty far for this to make sense. Because the thing is that my younger brother died like a month ago in a car accident leaving a club in Vegas, and it turns out that's the only reason my parents decided I existed again. I grew up in a house where I was basically invisible. I mean, my parents, Margaret and William, had this younger son, Connor, who was like the center of the family universe. I don't know how to explain it without sounding bitter. But imagine this. Connor would get a C in math, and my parents would take him out to dinner to celebrate that he tried really hard. While I'd come home with my report card with straight A's, and my dad would barely look up from the newspaper to say, "Well done," before going back to ignoring me. Connor was 2 years younger than me, and honestly, I never understood what was so special about him. Other than he was more outgoing than me, I guess more charismatic with adults, knew exactly what to say to make people adore him. I was the quiet nerd who spent weekends building robots in the garage and programming little games on my used laptop that I'd bought with my own money from mowing lawns, while Connor hung out with his friends, and my parents acted like he was the next president of the United States or something. The thing is, I was a good student, like really good. I had a 4 gigapascals in high school. I was in robotics club. I'd won a couple of state math competitions. Nothing huge, but enough to get the attention of some decent universities. Connor, on the other hand, struggled academically. He wasn't dumb or anything, but he just didn't really care about school, preferred to spend time at parties and being popular. My dad, William, had gone to Stanford back in the 82nds. It was like his proudest thing in life. He literally had a Stanford flag in his office and wore Stanford sweatshirts even in summer. It was almost pathetic how obsessed he was with that university. For years, I heard about how Connor was obviously going to go to Stanford because he was a legacy and because William knew people in the admissions department. This whole thing about connections and privilege that I honestly found kind of disgusting, but whatever. That was my family. The time came to apply to colleges. When I was 17, Connor was still 15. And I decided to apply to Stanford among other schools, basically because I thought, why not? I had the numbers. I had the extracurriculars. I'd worked hard my whole school life. I deserved to at least try. When I told my dad I was going to apply, he looked at me like I'd told him I was planning to rob a bank or something and said something like, "Well, it's competitive, but try, if you want," in a tone that made it super clear he didn't think I had a chance. My mom, Margaret, just nodded and changed the subject to talk about Connor's next soccer game. I applied anyway, wrote honest essays about my robotics projects and about how I wanted to study computer science, got incredible recommendation letters from my math and physics teachers, and basically gave it my best shot. March of my senior year, the Stanford letter came. You know, that big envelope that means you got in. And honestly, I almost passed out when I opened it. I'd been accepted with a partial merit-based scholarship, like they were offering me real financial aid because my grades and SAT scores were high enough. I ran to tell my parents, stupidly thinking that maybe, just maybe, this would be enough for them to see me differently, for them to feel proud of me for once in my life. My dad was in the kitchen with Connor, and when I showed them the letter, I swear the silence lasted like 15 full seconds. My dad finally said, "Congratulations, Ethan," but in the flattest tone you can imagine, and Connor looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher at the time, but that I now know was pure hatred. My mom came in, saw the letter, said something about it being a good school, and then literally asked what we wanted for dinner, as if I'd just shown them a normal report card and not a Stanford acceptance. Things got weird after that. I mean, Connor started acting super strange with me. He wouldn't talk to me much. When I'd ask him something, he'd respond with monosyllables. My parents kept being cold, but that wasn't new. What I didn't know was that Connor had also applied to Stanford that year as an early applicant and had been rejected in December. Like, completely rejected despite being a legacy, and despite all the calls my dad had made to his contacts at the university. Years later, I found out that Connor had told my parents that I must have cheated somehow to get in, that there was no way I'd be accepted, and he wouldn't, that obviously there was something shady about my application. My parents apparently believed him without questioning anything, because why would they question their perfect son? I started Stanford that fall, and honestly, the first few months were the best of my life up to that point. I had a roommate named Jake who was from Portland and was like the most genuine person I'd met. We became best friends almost immediately. We were both tech nerds, spent entire nights coding and drinking Red Bull, doing assignments for our computer science classes. I had a 3.9 gigapascals after my first semester. I joined the university's robotics club and had started working on a project with a group of students to build a robotic arm that could assist in surgeries. I'd even caught the attention of a Google recruiter who came to give a talk on campus and gave me his card after I showed him some of my projects. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, that all the hard work had been worth it. Connor, meanwhile, was at State College near home, still living with my parents because apparently he didn't want to waste money on dorms. According to my parents, he was doing well, but I had almost no contact with them, so I didn't know much. What I didn't know was that Connor was like obsessed with my life at Stanford. He'd created fake accounts on Instagram and Facebook to follow all my posts, screenshot my photos, basically stalk me digitally without me having any idea. Jake told me years later that Connor had tried to contact him on social media, pretending to be a high school friend of mine, trying to get information about my life, my friends, my classes, everything, halfway. Through my second year at Stanford, these weird accounts started appearing on Instagram with names similar to mine, but with a different number or letter. Like if my account was at Ethan Smith, the fake accounts were at Ethan Smith 1 or at Ethan Smith or things like that. These accounts had my photos, some that I'd posted and others I don't know where they got them from, and they started sending direct messages to Stanford students offering to sell Adderall and other study drugs. I had no idea this was happening because nobody was mentioning the accounts to me. People just assumed I was some kind of discreet dealer or something. Jake eventually found out because a guy from his chemistry class asked him if I was reliable to buy drugs from, and Jake obviously told him what the hell was he talking about, that I didn't sell anything. And the guy showed him the messages from one of the fake accounts. Jake came running to tell me, and I totally panicked. Like I reported the accounts to Instagram, tried to contact the people who'd received messages to explain it wasn't me, but the damage was already done. Some students started looking at me weird on campus. A couple of professors asked me if everything was okay, and I felt like I was losing my mind because I didn't understand who would do this to me or why. I changed all my passwords, made my main account private, did everything you're supposed to do when someone's harassing you online, but the fake accounts kept appearing. Then came the day that basically destroyed my life. And when I say destroyed, I'm not exaggerating one bit. It was a Tuesday in February. I was in my dorm room studying for an algorithms exam I had the next day. Jake had gone out to a party, but I'd stayed because I needed to study. Around 10 p.m., there was a knock on the door, and when I opened it, there were 2 campus police officers standing there, with super serious expressions. They told me they had a warrant to search my room based on reports that I was selling drugs to other students, and honestly, I thought it was a horrible joke. Like I laughed because it was so absurd it couldn't be real. But it wasn't a joke. They came into my room and started going through everything. My drawers, my closet, my backpack, everything. While I stood there in total shock, unable to process what was happening. They found a bag with marijuana hidden inside one of my textbooks on the shelf, like stuck between the pages of my calculus book that I almost never used because I preferred digital versions. They also found a bottle of unlabeled pills at the bottom of my underwear drawer, hidden inside a rolled-up sock. I literally couldn't speak. I just stood there with my mouth open while they pulled out these things I'd never seen in my life, that someone had obviously planted in my room. But how the hell was I going to prove that? They took me to the campus police station, took my photos, fingerprints, the whole complete process like I was a criminal. And we could think was that this had to be a nightmare. I was going to wake up from any moment. The next day, I found out that 3 different students had filed official testimonies saying that I'd sold them Adderall during the semester, that they'd paid me $20 per pill, that I was known in certain circles as someone reliable to get study drugs from. Years later, Jake discovered that Connor had paid each of these students $500 to lie, that he'd contacted them through Stanford Facebook groups and had given them exactly what to say, had even shown them photos of me so they'd know who I was. But at that moment, I didn't know any of this. I just knew that my perfect life was crumbling and that nobody believed me when I said I was innocent. The disciplinary hearing was like 2 weeks later, and my parents came. I guess because the university contacted them as my emergency contacts. I stupidly thought that maybe they'd support me, that they'd defend their son, but when they came to my temporary room, they'd moved me from the dorm while the case was being resolved. My dad looked at me and said, "How could you do this, Ethan? Do you know how embarrassing this is for me?" He didn't ask if it was true, didn't ask for my version of events, just assumed I was guilty. My mom was crying, but not from sadness for me, but from shame, like she was more worried about what her friends would think than about the fact that her son was being falsely accused of something he didn't do. The hearing was a nightmare. There was a panel of 3 deans and 2 student representatives, and they basically made me feel like a criminal from the first minute. They presented the evidence of the drugs found in my room, the testimonies of the 3 students who said I'd sold them Adderall, screenshots of the fake Instagram accounts which I kept insisting weren't mine, and honestly it didn't matter that Jake testified that I'd never sold drugs, that he was my roommate and had never seen anything suspicious, that I spent all my time studying and working on projects. I offered to take a drug test to prove I didn't even use anything, but they told me that wasn't relevant because the accusation was dealing, not consumption. A couple of professors wrote letters saying I was an exemplary student, that they'd never seen suspicious behavior, but none of that mattered. What I didn't know until years later was that my dad, William, was sending text messages to Connor during the entire hearing, like live updates of what was happening, and Connor was on the other side responding with things like, "Good, screw him," and "He'll see what it feels like to be the family failure." Jake eventually got these messages after Connor died. They were on Connor's phone that my parents gave to Jake for some strange reason when they were cleaning out his stuff. I guess they thought Jake was Connor's friend or something. I don't know. The point is that Jake saw the messages and we finally understood the full magnitude of what Connor had done. I was expelled from Stanford effectively immediately after the hearing. They wouldn't let me graduate, wouldn't let me transfer my credits because they marked my record as expulsion for drug dealing, basically destroyed any chance I had of continuing my university education anywhere respectable. My parents said nothing in my defense during the hearing. They sat there with embarrassed faces while the panel tore me apart. And after they read the verdict, my dad stood up, looked at me and said, "Don't come home," literally those exact words, and left with my mom following him without even turning to look at me. I stayed on campus for like another week while I figured out what the hell I was going to do with my life, packed all my stuff that fit in 2 large suitcases and a backpack, and Jake helped me sell everything else because I needed the money. I had like $3,000 in savings from summer jobs and some freelance programming projects I'd done, and I decided to go to Portland because Jake was from there and said I could stay with him temporarily while I got established. I had no other plan. I had no family that wanted me. I had no college degree. I had no references because Stanford had marked my record in such a way that I was basically untouchable for any employer who verified my academic history. Portland was brutal at first. And when I say brutal, I mean I lived in what was basically a converted pantry at Jake's parents' house for 3 months while I worked 3 jobs simultaneously trying to survive. I worked overnight shifts at Walmart restocking shelves from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., then slept like 4 hours, then did DoorDash deliveries during the afternoon, and 2 nights a week, I worked at this kind of sketchy sports bar waiting tables. I made maybe $2,000 a month if I was lucky and spent like $800 on food and transportation. And the rest I saved because I had this crazy idea that eventually I could go back to college or at least get some kind of programming certification. There was this diner in Portland called Dots, where I'd go almost every day during my few free hours because they had free Wi-Fi and nobody bothered you if you bought a $2 coffee, and stayed there for hours. The waitress, Linda, was this woman who was like 50 years old, who was incredibly kind. She noticed I was always on my laptop coding and started bringing me extra free food when the kitchen made too much, like a burger or fries, things I definitely couldn't afford, but that she said they were going to throw away anyway. I'll never forget her kindness because honestly, there were days when that free food was the only substantial thing I ate. At Dots, I started working on this personal project, an inventory management system for small businesses that was more intuitive than the expensive options that existed. I had no expectations that it would go anywhere. I just needed to keep my mind active and keep coding because I felt that if I stopped doing it, I'd lose the only valuable skill I had. I spent hours refining the code, making the interface more user-friendly, adding features I thought would be useful based on my experiences working in retail. After like 6 months of living in Portland with this insane schedule, a guy named Mark, who had a real estate office in the building next to Dots, saw me working one day and asked what I was doing. I showed him the inventory system and he was super impressed. Turns out his office was using this horrible software from the 90 seconds to track their properties and clients, and he asked me if I could build something similar for him. I said yes, obviously, because I desperately needed any job that paid more than minimum wage, and we agreed he'd pay me $20 an hour for freelance at work while I kept my other jobs. The system I built for Mark worked so well that he started recommending me to other real estate agents in the area, and suddenly I had this steady stream of freelance programming work that paid way better than restocking shelves at Walmart. After like 8 months of this, Mark offered me a full-time job as his IT guy in the office for $45,000 a year with benefits, and I literally cried when he offered it to me because it was more money than I'd made in my life, and it meant I could quit the other 3 jobs and maybe rent my own place. One day, Mark was sick and had to show this expensive house on the outskirts of Portland to some clients who were relocating from Silicon Valley, and he asked me if I could do it because there was nobody else available, and the clients didn't want to reschedule. I'd never shown a house in my life, but I'd heard Mark do it like 1,000 times. So I said yes. Turns out the clients were these software engineers who were moving to work remotely, and when I casually mentioned that I'd studied computer science at Stanford, conveniently omitting the expulsion part, we started talking about technology, and I ended up selling the house because we connected super well about programming topics and the tech market in Portland. Mark was so impressed that he sponsored me to get my real estate license, like he paid for the classes and the exam and everything, and told me that if I passed, I could work as a junior agent in his office while keeping the IT job. I studied obsessively for 2 months while working full-time and passed the exam on the first try with a high score. I started selling houses while still fixing computers and setting up networks for the office, and I discovered I was really good at this because I could speak the language of tech clients who were moving to Portland. I understood their needs. I could explain the market in terms that made sense to them. I built this website using my programming skills that predicted real estate market trends in Portland based on data from tech startups, big company hirings, and other economic indicators that other agents weren't tracking. The site started attracting clients organically because it was useful and free, and I always included my contact information as an agent. My strategy was to focus on tech workers who were relocating because I understood that world. I'd lived in Silicon Valley, albeit briefly, and I could talk about commute times to tech offices, neighborhoods with good Wi-Fi, all these things that mattered to that specific demographic. The first year I sold like $4 million in properties and made $88,200 in commissions, which was more than my parents made together at their regular jobs. The second year, I sold $7.2 million and made $145,000. The third year was when things exploded. I sold $14.2 million and made $285,000, and now in the last quarter, I sold $1.8 million just in that 3-month period. I bought my own house, a nice 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood with a big yard where I finally adopted a dog. A German Shepherd I named Pseudo because he responds to Linux commands, which probably says a lot about my nerd level. I hadn't talked to my parents this whole time, like 7 years of complete silence. And honestly, I'd made peace with that. Jake had moved to work for Google in Seattle, and we were still best friends. We talked almost every day. He knew my whole story and always told me that someday the truth would come to light. But I'd stopped believing in that kind of karmic justice. I had my life, I had my successful career. I had my dog. I'd started dating this incredible woman named Emily, who was a pediatric surgeon and who didn't care about my complicated past. And honestly, I was okay. Not completely happy, but functioning. Like a month ago, Jake called me super upset, saying that Connor had died in a car accident, that he'd left a club in Vegas around 3 a.m., driving drunk and crashed into a pole. I felt this weird thing in my chest when he told me. It wasn't exactly sadness because Connor had deliberately ruined my life, but it wasn't joy either, because I'm not a monster. It was more like this feeling of emptiness and confusion about how I was supposed to feel. Jake asked me if I was going to go to the funeral, and I told him not in a million years, that my parents had made it clear to me that I wasn't part of the family when they abandoned me 7 years ago. 3 weeks after the accident, my parents showed up at my door without warning, like they rang the doorbell on a Saturday morning when I was having coffee in my pajamas with Emily. And when I opened the door and saw them standing there, I almost had a heart attack. I hadn't seen their faces in 7 years. And they looked older, obviously. My dad had more gray hair and my mom looked tired. But the first thing that came out of my dad's mouth was, "I thought your house would be bigger with everything Jake says you earn. Not even a hello or how are you. Just an immediate criticism of my house that I'd worked like a dog to be able to buy." My mom started crying, saying they missed me, that they'd made a mistake, that Connor, before he died, had left a journal where he confessed everything he'd done to me, that they didn't know the accusations were false, that they genuinely believed I was a drug dealer all these years. I told them to get off my property, that they had no right to show up after 7 years expecting forgiveness, that they'd abandoned me when I needed them most, that they chose to believe Connor over me without even asking for my version of events. My dad tried to justify himself, saying the evidence was convincing, that any reasonable parent would have come to the same conclusion, and I literally yelled at him that a reasonable parent would have defended their son, would have investigated, would have questioned the narrative. After that visit, I called Jake again to understand what the hell had happened. And it turns out Jake had seen my parents at a tech conference in Seattle like 2 months ago, before Connor died, and had shown them all the evidence he'd been collecting for years, screenshots of the fake Instagram accounts Connor had created, testimonies from the students admitting Connor had paid them to lie. One of them eventually felt guilty and confessed to Jake. Records showing Connor had been at Stanford the day the drugs were planted in my room. Everything. My parents apparently didn't believe Jake at that time, said he was trying to protect me because we were friends, that Connor would never do something like that. But then Connor died, and they found that journal where he basically admitted everything, how he hated me for being accepted to Stanford when he was rejected, how he'd meticulously planned my destruction, how he convinced my parents I was the bad guy, how he felt guilty but also victorious. My parents read this and suddenly decided I deserved a second chance, that they wanted to get back their son, completely ignoring the fact that they left me homeless, without family, without a future for 7 years while I rebuilt my life from scratch. They came to my house, again last week, this time while I was on an important work call, and they rang the doorbell insistently until Emily opened the door because she was tired of the noise. They entered my house without invitation, sat down in my living room, and refused to leave when I asked them to. I had to end my work call and eventually call the police to have them escorted out of my property, and my dad was yelling things like, "You can't forgive your own family," while the officers were taking them out. It was humiliating and disturbing and confirmed everything I already knew about them, that even now, even knowing I was innocent all this time, they still think they have a right to my life, to my forgiveness, to my time. Emily, who is like the most compassionate person I know, has suggested to me that maybe I should give them a chance, that people make mistakes, that they're my parents, and they deserve at least a conversation. But I can't. I honestly can't see how I could sit at a table with them and act like the last 7 years didn't happen, like they didn't look me in the eyes during that hearing at Stanford and choose to believe Connor's lies about me. I've decided I'm going to file a restraining order if necessary, because I've realized that my peace of mind is worth more than any abstract concept of family. The other day, Sudo and I were in the yard. He was chasing a ball and I was thinking about all this, and I realized I've built a better life than I could ever have had if everything had gone according to the original plan. Yes, I lost Stanford. I lost 7 years dealing with trauma and struggling financially. I lost the relationship with my parents, although I don't know if I ever really had that relationship, but now I make more money than they do. I have a career I love. I have an incredible partner. I have Jake, who's been more family to me than my biological parents ever were. And I have my peace. I don't owe them anything. And I'm finally okay with that.